I suppose in terms of business and the role business can play in this, which is probably where I can best speak to, I think there's a role for business to take a leadership role and in set an example in terms of energy and renewable energy. And there are certain areas, I know for example CHP, which is combined heat and power, where you're generating electricity in a very efficient way, you're using the heat, and district heating, and this is we've seen this model in other countries. We haven't done it here, or if we have, we haven't done it very well, where you're using the heat from electricity generation, and sometimes that's community, sometimes it's industrial as well, where businesses are supplying communities with heat. And I think we can create examples, and I think renewable heat incentive is another area. We can create examples and exemplar projects where we're demonstrating these technologies and businesses taking a lead and showing how the energy can be generated renewably, how it can be used efficiently. And that in itself, I think, through the people who work for these businesses, the communities in which they operate, you then start to generate a little bit more, I suppose, momentum and interest in these type of technologies as well.
Can I go back to what you said, Paul, about yes, in our time we made mistakes, without doubt, who wouldn't? But mistakes because we were really doing something. I mean, renewable power doubled in our 4 years in office. Carbon emissions in 4 years, and political commitment's important, they fell 14% in our 4 years in office. And partly that was the recession, about half of it, but partly it was because agencies and everyone knew we were serious about this. We were going to do whatever it took to position Ireland as a leading decarbonised country. And even in terms of, I think, okay, if we're going to get 100% renewable, which I think we can, energy, and if it's going to be electricity as the key driver, yes, we'll use biomass for heat, particularly in industrial applications and elsewhere. How are we going to do it? We do have to win back public confidence, and we don't rush it. I think we could look at solar next as a real big opportunity. And I think when we're doing it, we should be doing it at rooftop level first, rather than necessarily going the big industrial solar in the field, because I think we need to get people involved. And that doing rooftop would be one of the ways of getting people involved. We need the public companies. I mean, one of the things we did in government, we had a €30 billion investment plan with ESB, Bord na Móna, Bord Gáis. We need to go back to that. And I think we need to set ourselves a target. If it's 2050, 100% renewable, and if in that time every wind turbine is going to be changed, they're not going to last 30, 40 years, let's set ourselves the target that it's 100% community owned by 2050. So, not the Danes' 20% measure. Let's go the whole way and set ourselves a target, set the financing system in place. It is not beyond our means, use our pensions and use other mechanisms to say we're 100% renewable, we're 100% community owned. And be sensitive on the planning issue. We can only do so much onshore. We have to go offshore. And we're going to have to connect with France and England and the rest of Northwestern Europe to make it economic. Ultimately, to get to that target, you've got to share with your neighbours. That's what the latest research in the EU shows. So they're the sort of changes we need to make. We don't have to rush it. We don't have to panic. We have the best resource in the world. It's not going to go away. But we should let the industry know that this is going to happen. No hedges, no partly, 100% renewable in 30, 40 years' time. That's doable. And I think that certainty will make the investment case much easier, and then it starts to flow.
Okay. I'm going to skip you, Frank. And I had Frank here in the front, and then the man with the glasses there in the fourth row. Just Frank here.
It's largely the absence of social costing that is skewing Ireland's...
So you can have a chance, but just Frank first, please.
Before recent events, there are currently 27 applications for data centres in Ireland. These are very big. The one in Athenry, the Apple one, is 850 million, probably about $1 billion project when it's built. So that's quite an investment in Ireland. These are big users of electricity. Now, the 27 are, we have a lot built in Ireland. All the big companies have data centres already in Ireland. They're building more. And that's before the Schrems judgment in the European Court on data protection. And the effect of the Schrems judgment, even though Ireland fought it, the effect of it will be, of the European Court judgment, will be that the American companies will have to build data centres in Europe. They don't want it in continental Europe because of the climate differences. So Ireland and the UK will be favoured. They're wary of the UK because of GCHQ. Having obligations to America to hand over data. So really, they are favouring Ireland. So the 27 is only the tip of the iceberg. We're going to have a lot more than 27 applications for data centres. Some of them at the moment are not using,
can you
are
put a
not
question, Frank, please?
collecting their energy, okay? Shouldn't we have a policy right from the very beginning that all the energy should be trapped either for horticultural beside it or else to loop into electricity to run the data centres? They're emitting, some of the applications are to emit the emissions right into the atmosphere, and Ireland will pay for that. And I just wonder, is this not the time, before the tsunami of applications come in, we should welcome them, but make sure they use their emissions in a loop, okay?
Okay. Anyone want to take that in particular? Okay.
I think it's an excellent idea, and that idea, I mean, and I know I've heard this idea in terms of you could feed into horticultural sector, which is some of where our food industry could go, which, you know, otherwise we're burning gas to grow tomatoes, which is not very clever. We could use waste heat off those systems. So, and it ultimately, I think the point you make is a good one. There is a digital revolution taking place. There's also an energy revolution taking place. And go back to that dance I mentioned, efficiency and variable supply going at the same time. That's where the world economy is going. That's the big transition that's happening at this present time. We have every reason to lead it because we have the tech industry here and we've one of the best renewable energy resources in the world. Combining the two, big vision I would have is even you have a Northwest Europe connected grid. This is thinking big long term, but this is viable. You have data centres in Finland and Sweden because that's also cool climate. You could switch your data, switch on and off depending on where the wind is. You start matching power supply and power use in that way, and you get a secure, balanced, synchronized Northwest European system. That's viable now because new HVDC grids can actually ship power long distance without losses. It allows you to manage the variability in renewable supplies. That's what Europe's talking about when it mentions this big energy union project. That's the end goal that they're aiming for. That's happening at the moment. The real risk is, the reality of what's happening in Europe is Ireland's going to be excluded because the UK is stepping back from Europe. That's a real policy, political risk at the present time from that big prospect. We won't be able to run 27 data centres if we're not connected into Northwest Europe in the way I'm setting out there.
Yeah, conscious of time, I mean, I think it's a good idea because building sustainability in right from the start and taking a holistic approach has to be the right thing to do. So half doing it doesn't feel right to me. And the second point is, I mean, I think the kind of end customers of some of the companies you talked about would expect them to be having a truly sustainable solution. It's in all our interests to make sure that becomes a reality.
Gentleman here. Yep.
Oh, just one last point. Dairy and heat. Could you use the heat in the dairy system?
The heat from a data centre? Yeah. It's a good question. I don't know.
Talk to him.
Giving Eamon Ryan a mic is a bad idea. Sorry.
Hi, how are you doing? Just like going off the emissions on the board there, the EPA predicts Ireland will struggle to meet 20% reduction of emissions by 2020. Just following on from that, in the recent EPA's State of the Environment report in 2011, it stated that Ireland's emissions are actually projected to increase by 2020, and the biggest leader of our emissions is the agricultural industry. And I was just wondering, is there any issues or ways, policies that are being put forward to try and tackle the agricultural industry? Because that is it just seems we tend to focus a lot on fossil fuels. Well, obviously that's very important as well, but it makes more sense to kind of attack the biggest producer. Not attack, I'm not saying like to get rid of it,
words,
yeah. But just to kind of, is there any ways that we can shift our agriculture in a way that reduces our greenhouse gas
Can I ask you to give the mic to the gentleman with the beard just beside you, because he also had his hand up, and we'll take that question again, and then we'll come to the two gentlemen at the back. But if you pose your question as well, please.
Yeah, I just have a very simple question. I think Ireland is in a remarkable position in that at the moment money is worth about 1% and we own the banks. What is stopping us from instructing the banks to make money available at, say, 3% to businesses and householders for energy saving improvements? I don't understand why we're not doing that.
Okay. Obviously agriculture might be interesting to hear from you, Davy.
Okay, so yeah, agriculture and, dairy obviously being a major industry in Ireland. So I suppose, from an economic point of view, dairy is very important to the country. It is projected to increase by anything up to 50% in terms of output by 2020. And I think that's a challenge. There's a couple of mitigating factors within that, I suppose. One is that we are very efficient as a dairy country, and I think earlier today Pádraig Brennan said we are one of the most efficient per carbon per kilogram of milk in Europe. We can get better. So I think there's an opportunity there to work, and Dairygold as a co-op are working with our farmers. We've invested significant money with Teagasc on a joint advisory program looking at on-farm efficiency. That's one area. I think within that as well, I think the emissions, and Frank will correct me if I'm wrong here, there's a prediction of about a 2% increase between now and 2020 in agriculture, but overall it'll be 5% lower than it was, give or take, in 2005, if I'm not mistaken. So some of that will be mitigated by efficiency within on the farm. Some of it will be a change in the mix in terms of dairy and beef as well. There'll be less beef animals, more dairy animals. So while we will see an increase in output, we won't see a very significant increase in emissions between now and 2020. But there is a challenge there, and in terms of meeting our EU targets, there is a gap. Now, it is part of a bigger, I suppose, pot with transport and commercial and waste under the effort sharing decision. And I think we need to look at the balance there. There's a bit about food security as well. There's a bit about Europe recognising, land use, afforestation, all those need to be considered as well. And I think there's an opportunity in the land use sector in particular, which is not currently counted in terms of Ireland's EU targets, but if we're planting more forests, that's creating carbon sinks. I suppose there's a link between agriculture and the land use sector as well, and there are things we need to look at there in terms of we're growing output, we're producing quality produce, we're producing it efficiently. So are there other things we can do to offset those emissions?
Do you have anything extra to add?
Not really. I suppose just going back to what I said earlier, each of the sectors is anticipated to produce a mitigation plan, and agriculture will be part of that process. So that will be produced, I think, in December, before the end of the year. So each of the sectors is looking very closely at the challenge, the opportunities, the what is in place, what is not in place. It's been mentioned, obviously, the land agriculture issue is complex, and we need to look at that and see how we can gain make land management sustainable, particularly in relation to forest, grassland and cropland, and going into the peat area. That's a very difficult one. But that sector really has to look at how it can advance, can avail of mitigation opportunities that are there. And I know that there's a lot of investment in research in terms of, Teagasc are doing a lot of work in terms of looking at the DNA of cattle, of the herd. So there will be more opportunities in that sector, but from a climate perspective, the key challenge is to decarbonise, to get rid of fossil energy from our system, and I would echo what Eamon has said on that.
I've already defended Alan Kelly. Now I'm going to read into the mind. Excuse me. I'm reading into the mind of Michael Noonan just on the question. One of the reasons on the banks issue is obviously that they're setting them up for sale. So making huge commitments for investment might just make them less interesting to buyers. So that's obviously the thing. But just to come to Michael on the question of finance and how this can be done, not necessarily through the sale of AIB, but other ways. What steps can government take? And then I'll come to the other two questions, and then I think we'll call a halt after that.
Yeah, just on your idea, I think if government banks had the money, it is a good idea. One of the most successful schemes we ran in the UK was an interest-free scheme for SMEs. And interest-free sounds pretty compelling, and we found it very difficult to create demand for that scheme. So what we found was cheap finance on its own for that particular sector is not sufficient. You need to combine that with awareness raising, with advice, and ideally with kind of carrot and stick incentives, so that if people kind of invest, that over time, that their taxes potentially are lower. If they don't invest and seize the opportunity, then potentially they pay more for energy or more over time. So I do think for that particular segment of the market, something like that to get moving, because energy efficiency, as compelling as it is, it's also incredibly difficult. For larger organisations, what we found is that generally they have access to finance, and therefore it is about advice. It's about making the business case and moving it forward in that way. I think the other gap in terms of finance that we've seen in our experience in the UK is for support for early stage technologies. You know, when technologies are broadly proven, you know, project finance comes in, but there's a real gap very often between kind of great research from universities and actually getting technologies to the point where they're investable in the market. I mean, wave energy might be a technology with a huge potential, but actually a very long way at this stage from being commercial, and therefore will need support from governments around the world if we are indeed going to commercialise that technology.
We'll just take 2 more questions. The man on the left, and then after you, the man with the beard.
If you had correct social costing on carbon footprints, it would throttle back on slave labour imports and also centralised low-tech industries such as bakeries. I mean, Alan gave us a brilliant presentation on a micro level, but that is destroying local production throughout Ireland, within local communities. Anybody can bake bread. You don't need a massive centralised operation. So if you start putting into place correct social costing on carbon footprint, you wouldn't need to worry so much about EU targets. Business would take care of it itself. And it would make a massive strive to stabilizing economies and broadening economies throughout any particular nation. So it's social costing that should be looked at. And it's not just on carbon footprint, it's across the board. Peat, as the gentleman said just now, you know, burning peat is massively destructive, not just from its green effect, but that's because there's not correct social costing on those resources.
Okay, I'm going to get Eamon Ryan to pick that up. Could you pass the mic to the man with the beard who also wanted to get in? Sorry for describing you as such, but that's it.
It's a moustache. Ross Golden Bannon from the Irish Food Writers Guild. A lot of you have spoken around food, and so it's obviously an important issue around sustainability, as many of you have already probably seen. Very late in our view, the national press has picked up on the issue of TTIP. Darina Allen has described TTIP as possibly the greatest threat to our democracy since the foundation of the state. It's an issue that's of great concern to us in the Guild, to many chefs and producers across the country. It's sadly ignored to the most part in the mainstream media, but it's clearly a concern to all the panelists in my view, and I'm just wondering what your view might be on a post-TTIP world and the kinds of legislation and hopes that you have around the policies that you've been discussing, because in our view they're sort of built on sand really, especially when you look at the ISDSs, the secret courts that will come into play with ISDS, which means that international companies will be able to sue national companies in Ireland if they feel that they are, legislation at a national level, if they feel the legislation is a barrier to their trade. So just in case people think that isn't the case, that has already happened in Canada, and of course, as we all know, the Japanese tobacco company are taking the Irish government to court over our legislation around packaging on cigarettes.
Yeah. Okay, Eamon, if I can ask you to pick up on social costing, and then we'll just work our way down the couch, and then after that, I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap up the panel discussion. But Eamon first.
Can I wrap up a couple of those questions into the answer I give? I remember I was involved looking at the banks in 2008. We got the shocking thing. We got the bank books. I remember opening them up and seeing what they had on the property side, and seeing that they had 2% of their book was in energy loans. And it was the most secure bet. I said, what are you doing? And the world has changed since 2008. The world changed fundamentally. And I think that gentleman's right. I think the whole economic model, in a sense, needs to change to a proper social cost accounting. Taking those sustainable development goals that were agreed in New York 2 weeks ago, which apply to the Northern Hemisphere as much as the South, and applying a whole range of different social costing to new economic business. The economic model fundamentally has to change towards a sustainable one. That is not on the way TTIP is doing it. The way TTIP is doing it is an old pre-2008 secret globalization deals for large multinational companies that does not actually create sustainability. It has to change. It has to be transparent, which it isn't, and it has to be sure that it doesn't undermine sustainability. And we need to decide where do we stand as a country. If we're origin green, we got to be origin green in everything we do. Or else we're not going to get a good price. We're not going to have a livelihood that's really secure and stable. So I think we need to just step up the plate, decide where do we place ourselves. We're just coming out, thank God, of the worst economic crashes. The question, the next election, the question is now, where do we go from here? And it's, I think, green, ecological, sustainable is what suits this country. Fair trade, proper social costing, as the gentleman said, and the banks lending 50% of their book to energy rather than 2% as they did in 2008.
I think I'm going to have to pass a little bit on the TTIP question, because I will admit I'm not as familiar and up to speed, and I think that's maybe an issue that has been identified, that people don't really understand what it's about. I'm aware it's in the general I suppose consciousness there, and as you say, Dorina Allen, I read the piece in the paper where she called it out, but I know it's important, but I don't know how and why it's important at the moment. I think yeah, okay. As an export business, I suppose trade is important to us. You know, we're very much export focused. But look, as regards TTIP, I can't really comment on that. I will echo though what Eamon has said in terms of, you know, sustainability and how important that is to the Irish food industry. And I think it is critically important, be it large producers like ourselves or small producers. I think this is how we are going to, I suppose, create our niche in the world market in terms of the food products we make. And Origin Green, obviously, we consider that as a business very, very important. Okay.
Last word.
Last word. I think I agree. I mean, the core of this is actually deciding you want to go on the journey, and then there are lots of obstacles that are going to stop us, you know, doing the right thing in terms of leadership around sustainability. But as a country, or as, you know, an individual company or an individual person, it's about actually wanting to go on that journey and actually starting to move and to see the long-term opportunity. And I'm absolutely convinced there's a huge long-term opportunity here for Ireland, for companies who embrace this as an agenda. And that's what I think we need to do.
Thank you very much. Okay, ladies and gents, I'd like to thank my four panellists for the discussion. We've got one next session. We're running a little bit over, so we're just going to go directly onto it now. So I'd like to thank the guests and ask them to step down.